Welcome to That's a Hard No, the podcast about learning to say no and set boundaries to live our best lives. I'm your host, Heather Drago. You may think, because of this podcast, that I'm a boundary setting expert, but I'm not. I'm an expert at struggling to set boundaries. But you know what? I'm working on it, and it is getting easier. Follow along with me as I learn from fellow strugglers and experts so that you too can start saying no without feeling fear, guilt, or FOMO.
You don't know where to go. Unfriendly applications got you feeling low. You're not sure what to do. Weight of expectations is coming down on you. There's a phrase you should know. Tastes so much sweeter than hello. That's a hard no.
So when we're setting boundaries around here, we sort of find this difficulty curve that appears around who we're talking to and what the boundary we're setting is. The little things like insisting that your incorrect order at Starbucks be corrected come pretty quickly. The more important boundary you're setting and the more important person you're setting it with, the harder it can be to set and maintain a boundary that you need. The hardest boundaries come between family and around the most sensitive issues. When you've got a partner, a sibling, a parent who has real problems, it can be so hard to even see it as an issue. And once you do, rearranging your brain to fight your survival instincts and make a boundary can feel impossible. Well, our guest today knows how much work it takes to set a boundary with a parent and also knows how much you can improve your life by doing the work. Lianna Purjes is a therapist and empowerment coach with a master's in social work and education. She's spent over 15 years helping clients improve their relationships and strategize to grow for the long term. As an adult child of an alcoholic herself, Lianna has decided to develop a program from her clinical training and her own experiences setting boundaries with an addict parent. So Lianna, thanks so much for coming on. It's so nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited about this conversation. I think a lot of us deal with a lot of baggage and family history and family dynamics. And because we grow up in these situations, we just think it's normal.
Mhm.
And we're not aware it's not normal until we really learn what happens in codependent relationships and when you're a child of an alcoholic or addict. So I was reading through your bio and I see that you help adult children of alcoholics. And I was fascinated because I wanted to point out that even if you don't identify as a child of an alcoholic, an adult child of an alcoholic, you may be affected by it. And so in my case, I did not have an alcoholic in my household, but my mother's father was an alcoholic and it severely impacted her life in very many ways. And then my father, her husband, it turned out was an addict. And she set a very firm boundary so that when I was an infant, he was gone. He was not a part of my life because she just wasn't going to continue that. But that also impacted my life. And so it was as a young 20-something, I realized, okay, something isn't right with me. I need to figure. And so I found ACOA groups, and it was incredibly helpful to me. And I never would have identified that as being part of the source of the problems I was dealing with. So I just wanted to kind of lay that out there. Like, even if you don't identify as someone who grew up in a household like that, like generationally, these kinds of things can impact you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think my story is very similar. I didn't know that my mother had a drinking problem until I was 20 years old, because she hid it very well.
Wow.
I mean, and that's, a common symptom of addiction is just hiding. So yeah, but I still, as a child and especially as a teenager, I always felt like something was off. I always felt like there was something wrong with me, different about me. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I knew something was different. And I saw the way like my friends' families would interact with each other and, even little things. Like we never had like dinner together as a family. Like we would all just eat separately in our rooms watching TV. And, now as an adult and knowing what I know, I look back on that and I think, oh, okay, that's probably because my mom didn't want us, my brother and I, to see her drinking. But at
Mm-hmm.
the time, I didn't know that, but that was just the norm in our home. And then I would go to my friends' houses and see, oh wait, no, they like sit down and have dinner together and talk, and that's very different. So I always, had this feeling, this gut thing, like something's different, something's off. But, like you said, I didn't know it was, related to addiction until I was an adult.
When people come to you for help, or you meet people in these I never can say it right, OCOA
ACOA.
groups.
Yeah.
I always say it wrong, ACOA. Um, what are the kinds of things that people struggle with that are directly related to being an adult child of an alcoholic?
Yeah. So a lot of the issues I see are playing out in their adult relationships. So there often there often will be some issues with self-esteem and things like that, but most of what we can see or is more concrete is in the relationships. So there's often an insecure attachment. So people will have kind of a push-pull dynamic. They'll, desperately want emotional intimacy, to be close to people more than anything. And then when someone starts to get really close, wherever that limit is, they push away or they do something to pick a fight so that, we don't get too close because that's scary and unfamiliar. I see a lot of communication issues in terms of communicating their needs, a lot of people pleasing. A lot of kids that grow up in homes with addiction or any, yeah, I'm raising her. Yeah, right. That 100% was me too. Yeah, it's just because you learn as a child that, okay, if I people please, then, it doesn't feel great, but it feels safer than what happens when I stand up for myself. So we just get into that habit and it just becomes second nature. Um, and I'd say the other big thing is, like boundaries and communication skills in general. Addiction, I see addiction as almost as a symptom, right? Like people rely on substance use to numb emotional pain, to not have to feel discomfort with certain things. So what goes along with that naturally is not talking about feelings and not communicating your needs and just keeping it all inside and or ignoring it even. So kids who grow up with that, that gets modeled for them and then they end up doing it themselves.
So how do you break the pattern? Like what are some first steps that you or first mindset shifts you help people embrace when they're learning to set boundaries and learning to stand up for themselves and get their needs met?
Yeah, it's a great question. I always start with education. I want to give people a good background, some psychoed in what growing up like this does to a child's developing brain, how the attachment issues play out. There's a lot of research behind attachment. Um, and just having an understanding. I think having that context is really important. I remember the first time I read a research article about attachment was once I was getting trained as a therapist, and my mind was blown, and I just thought, oh, light bulb. I mean, this is incredible. I can't believe I have never heard of this before. Because it really just explains so much. So I like to give a lot of context and background. And then I think really the first and probably most important step is to just start noticing patterns and noticing urges and noticing discomfort. Um, a lot of times we're not aware that we're doing these things like people pleasing. We're not aware that we have a hard time setting boundaries. Sometimes we are, but sometimes we're not. So And I think for kids who grew up in a dysfunctional home, they kind of get used to not paying attention to those things because again, it's about survival. Um, so, I always recommend let's just start noticing. And we're not judging. We're not saying it's bad or I'm messed up or something's wrong with me. We're just noticing what are those natural reactions and feelings that come up, because I think it's really important to be aware of them so then we can figure out a plan on shifting that mindset.
So I'm fascinated. You talked about how your mind was blown. Tell us more about attachment and what happens to children when they grow up in a household,
Yeah.
and how that affects them as an adult.
Yeah, so attachment theory was developed about 50 years ago, maybe. And it was first developed by Bowlby and Ainsworth. They did some studies where they looked at what happens. It was called the stranger experiment, and they looked at what happens with toddlers when mom or primary caregiver leaves the room, when primary caregiver comes back, when there's a stranger in the room, all these different combinations of scenarios. And what they realized was that kids who had what we call a secure attachment, the healthiest type of attachment, um, they had what we all know toddlers often do. They have that separation anxiety, right? So primary caregiver leaves the room and they cry or they're screaming or saying, mommy, mommy, whatever it is. And what they noticed was that kids who did not have a secure attachment, and there's three types of insecure attachment, that they reacted very differently. Depending on the type of attachment, they would not really care that much. It wouldn't faze them. They would just keep playing. Or, they would maybe get upset, but then when primary caregiver comes back in the room, they are a little wary and they're not comforted by seeing primary caregiver. So, different kind of scenarios that play out. And then, what they look at also is how that plays out in our adult relationships. So, for example, a child who grows up with parents who say, anytime they're hurt or upset, they respond with, oh, just tough it out. You're fine. You're not a big deal. Why are you crying? Boys don't cry, things like that. If that becomes a pattern, I mean, obviously, like, you say it once, that's not going to have a huge impact on a
Right,
child,
right.
right? We're talking about patterns and consistency. But if that's consistently the response to the child, then they often grow up to have an avoidant attachment style, which means that they don't look to others for comfort when they're upset. They downplay their feelings or try to ignore them. And they also typically will have a hard time comforting other people when they're upset because it's just something they didn't experience very much. They don't know how to do that. So the attachment stuff is, it's tricky because it's not like we have a blood test to say, okay, 100% this is your type. It's all based on observation and description of behaviors and tendencies. But yeah, that's basically the gist of that. How we attach and feel safe or unsafe with our primary caregiver in early childhood impacts our adult relationships.
Wow. Okay, I'm just absorbing.
Yeah, yeah,
So, well, that's really fascinating, and um, it spurs several questions in my head. So, when someone gains the insight that you've offered us, and I'm sure there's much, much more, um, what boundaries do you typically help people learn to set in order to have healthy and functional relationships and get their needs met? Like, what are the typical kinds of things that people struggle setting boundaries around, and how what advice do you have for people if they're like me in the beginning, super uncomfortable setting those boundaries?
yeah. Well, first I say it's expected that you're uncomfortable setting those boundaries. Let's think about how you grew up, whatever it looked like. It obviously was not modeled for you. So of course it's uncomfortable. It's just normalizing that discomfort, right? Um, and I usually start with people with let's practice just saying no. Just saying no to things you don't want to do. And it can be small things, right? Like I'm not, it doesn't have to be huge things, but even just like, hey, do you want to have pizza for dinner? No, actually, I don't want to have pizza for dinner. Little things like that because it's it's hard, right? Like I can, speak for myself. I was a big people pleaser and I didn't even know it. Um, and I wouldn't even think before responding. If someone asked me for a favor or asked me something, it didn't even occur to me, oh, wait, I should think if I want this or not and say yes or no. I was just like, oh, yeah, sure, no problem. Like it just was autopilot. It just came spewing out of my mouth. And then what happens is you don't feel great about it. You beat yourself up about it. You end up doing something you don't want to do because later on you're like, wait, how did I get here? Right? Um, so I really work with people on let's just try to say no and start with those more minor things that are not like life-changing decisions, right? Because that's going to be have more pressure on it, but pause. If someone asks you a question, don't just respond right away. Don't go on autopilot. Just pause, take a breath, and really think, do I want to do this thing? And if you don't, that's okay. And you can say that.
I love this. I don't know if you're familiar with the background of how this all started, this podcast.
Mhm.
Um, but I, in 2019, announced this is my year of no because I knew I literally would get nauseous and sweaty and all the physical anxiety symptoms you can think of I would get just to say no to someone. And so I decided I would say no to one thing every day to practice that muscle. And it could be a very tiny thing. And I called it finding the no. And it was not answering a phone call, not responding to a text at 7 a.m. Saying, no, I don't want to do the thing, or no, I can't volunteer. I don't have the time to do this PTA thing or whatever it was. And it took a long time. It took probably, I started at the beginning of the year till May to actually really do it every day. And I still was uncomfortable with it towards the end of the year. And so I just continued, and it's just been this ongoing thing. So I like that you say practice saying no, say no to just little things, take that pause. The other thing I did, and I don't know if this is part of what you teach as well, is I wrote it down. I wrote down and kept track of all the times I said no and how I felt. So I could see the progress I was making from I'm going to throw up to I feel relieved. So I just love that you start with that.
Yeah, and I love hearing your story about that. And I'm not surprised to hear that it took 5 months to get to a place where you were doing it consistently because it's hard. And it's funny because when we think about it, it doesn't sound that hard. Just say no. It's part of our vocabulary, whatever, it's just like
Yeah.
it's a word.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are very uncomfortable with it. And, that can be for a variety of reasons, but I definitely think this is one of the top issues I see with adults who grew up with addiction or some other kind of dysfunction is that discomfort, like you said, of saying no, where you either don't even do it or when you do it, you get physically ill, like you said.
Yeah. So what kind of boundaries have you had to set to create healthy relationships and make space for yourself?
Yeah, so I really started with my mom, who was the addict in my life, and she passed away a couple years ago. But that was a big one for me. That was really hard because I loved her. Obviously, she was my mom, right? Like it didn't matter what was going on. That's my mom. And really having to set boundaries around, how much I was gonna step in and help her or not, when to do that, because there's this really fine line when you love someone with a substance use disorder about not enabling but still wanting to support. And so It took a lot of trial and error for sure, but that was a big thing I worked on. And then, once I started getting into a groove with that, I really looked at my dating relationships at the time and friendships and also at work. I think for me, work was especially hard. It was something about like authority figures and feeling really uncomfortable saying no to a boss.
Mhm.
Um, and everyone's different. It can play out in different ways, but for me, it was really tough at work. Just being able to say, no, I can't, stay after school to do this other thing, as a teacher at the time. And that was really hard because, and I think that's why a lot of people now are talking more about work-life balance of like, no, we shouldn't be available 24/7 for work. It's not healthy. Um, but this was maybe 15 years ago where that wasn't such a common phrase to use. So I really struggled with that. But again, it just takes practice. It's like learning how to ride a bike. You have to practice it, and you can't give up the first time you fall off because then you'll never learn. You just got to get back on and keep going.
Totally agree. And I often, as I tell my story, I remind people I messed up. I hurt people's feelings. I I had to break some relationships. I annoyed people. I flubbed. It was just like it literally took practice. So on that happy note of messing up, I'm going to take a pause so I can gather myself for our next part of this conversation, and we'll be right back. That's a Hard No is brought to you by Clever Grow Marketing, my full service agency specializing in smart, strategic marketing solutions for businesses and nonprofits. Okay, so you're probably wondering, Heather, what's with the podcast about boundaries? Why not marketing? Well, maybe in the future, but for now, it actually does relate, so bear with me here. Smart marketing, strategic marketing, requires knowing what to say no to and why. Businesses and nonprofits get inundated with marketing options and offers every day. We help you cut through all that noise, focus on your specific needs, and develop actionable strategies that are doable and actually make sense. Whether it's websites, SEO, email, social, or traditional channels, we're experienced in all of it. So if you need help figuring out your marketing, visit our website, clevergrowmarketing.com, and get in touch. I so loved this conversation and everything that Lianna was sharing with us. My mind was a little blown after the break. The next part of our conversation is also so valuable and really helps lay out where supporting a loved one can turn into enabling their addiction. As we or our loved ones run into these uncomfortable situations, we can all stand to learn the tools that Lianna shares with us here. There's a fine line, I think, sometimes between being empathetic and supportive and being enabling. So I wonder if you want to dive in a little deeper on that.
Yeah, I think it's a great and complex topic for sure.
Right, right.
I think the first part is just to recognize like that struggle is normal and expected. And of course, like you care about this person, so of course you're going to want to help them, right? I mean, how could you not? That's just how we're built as humans. Um, and and then I think, it really comes down to thinking about you and your personal boundaries and your own lines and where they are. Um, and I think those can change over time and it can be, I always say it's almost like a draft document, right? Like it's not something set in stone. It can change. You can go back to the drawing board and say, oh wait, actually this is too much for me. I want to switch this to this. But really have to figure out what you're comfortable with, what you're super uncomfortable with, and what you're slightly uncomfortable with, right? I mean, there's going to be some discomfort. We know this. So we don't want to say, well, I'm drawing the line at discomfort because then, I mean, honestly, then you can't have a relationship with anyone. Just as humans, we disagree. We're uncomfortable sometimes. It's not always good. We have to tolerate a little bit of discomfort. Um, But we do want to think about what is too much, what crosses a line. So like me, for example, I know that I have a tendency to yell and get really, really angry. My pattern that I developed from childhood was, well, it's not okay to have feelings. It's not okay to be sad or feel hurt, but it's super okay to yell and throw things and be angry. That's the home I grew up in. So for me, that became my big issue as an adult. I went to anger and irritability right away, because that was just the more comfortable emotion rather than sadness. Um, so, I've done a lot of work and I'm a lot better, but still it's something that can come up. So like I have a rule with my husband. I say to him, if we're arguing and things are escalating and I tell you I need a break, that's me catching myself before I reach max level and start yelling. He doesn't like it when I yell. I get that. That's fair. And if you don't want me to yell, like when I say I need a break, that has to be honored. Like that's a non-negotiable for me. We can come back to it later when we're both calmer. I'm not saying we're not going to resolve it. It's just I need a break in this moment. Um, and so and it took a lot of trial and error for me to get there and to try to figure out, okay, where is this point before I boil over, where I can notice I'm getting there. I need to cool off and I need a minute. Um, so yeah, when it comes to finding those lines, I think it just takes some trial and error, which, sucks. Like, let's be real. Like, it's not fun. I get that. The process can be frustrating until you figure out where your lines are, but it's absolutely worth it because once you figure it out, it's like, yes, okay, I got this. I have a little blueprint. I can use this now. Um, so I think when it comes to this line between empathy and enabling, it's really about figuring out where those lines are for you and just being okay with playing around with it.
That's so interesting, and I love that you reemphasize the pause. I think that pause is the magic trick
Hmm.
because you have to give yourself time when you're in the heat of the moment, in the middle of an exchange with someone or in a situation or someone's offering you something or asking something, whatever it is. We often feel the pressure to react immediately, and we don't have to. We think we do, but we don't have to. You can ask for a minute. You can say, I need to use the bathroom. I'll be back in a few minutes.
Yeah.
Like whatever you need to do, take that pause so you can absorb and think and decide before you commit yourself to something or before you do something for someone that you may regret later.
Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely. The power of the pause. It's
Yeah.
incredible. And this is in
That's the show title, Power of the Pause. There we go.
okay.
I love it.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's hard, right? This is not easy to do because, like you said, when you're in the heat of the moment, like this has to do with our nervous system regulation and what's going on in the brain. We're not thinking as rationally as we normally would. It would almost be like saying if you're in a near car accident, someone almost hits you and your heart is racing and someone says, "Hey, do your taxes." I mean, like, of course you're not gonna think very clearly and do a good job, right? No one would say, "Yeah, do your
Even on a good
taxes."
day with the
Right,
taxes on.
exactly. It's hard as it is, right? So we want to be in our best possible state when we're having tough conversations. And when we're
Mhm.
already getting heated and escalated, that is not the best time. So you can always
Mhm.
pause and come back to it later.
Yeah. And you would know this more than I, but I'm based on conversations I've had with people and what I've read and my own self-help journey. Um, for those of us who grew up in non-typical, I would say, non-ideal households, not only do we have emotional triggers, but like physically, our DNA is different. Like as an infant, as a child, or whatever. Like physically, you are altered
Yes.
And so chemicals start flowing, hormones start flowing. Like you literally have a visceral physical reaction, partly because of how you grew up. And so, like you said, if in the heat of the moment, you don't allow yourself a moment to assess how you're physically feeling and how you're emotionally feeling, then you really could get yourself stuck in some patterns you don't like.
Yeah, absolutely. They've actually done a bunch of studies on this, especially in the last 30 years or so. Um, and they've done a lot of brain scans of brains of adults and kids who experienced trauma in childhood and ones who didn't. And the brains look different.
Wow.
I'm not a neurologist, I can't tell you all the specifics, but when you look at these images side by side, I mean, it's just common sense. You can see the colors are different and the areas of the brain that light up are very different. Um, and so that's where a lot of this understanding of trauma comes from, is seeing this rewires the brain. So when you grow up with some kind of trauma, neglect, whatever it is, um, often what happens is the brain is rewired a little bit more for survival. And that doesn't mean you're in survival mode 24/7. No one can survive like that, that's just too much for any brain to handle. It's just that you go there more quickly and you stay there longer than the average person. So, like you said, it becomes harder for people who grew up like this to regulate their emotions and be able to communicate and do all these things on a more rational level.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So, circling back to dealing with or having relationships with people with substance abuse disorder, um, what are the firm boundaries that we need to set with those people? Does it vary per situation, per individual, or are there some commonalities?
I think there are some commonalities in terms of substance use. I think a good boundary for everyone to set is do not supply them with the substance. Um, Addicts will, and this is not to criticize them, this is the disease. The disease of addiction will make someone do pretty much anything to get a hold of that substance again and again and again. Again, this is something we've seen through brain research, that their brain chemistry is altered once they develop a dependence on a substance. So it's not like they're choosing it consciously. It's just this thing in them that is driving them. It's like if you have an itch and you try not to scratch it, they can't help it. They have to try and scratch it. So don't give them the substance. They will likely say and do all sorts of things to whatever they can to get a hold of that substance. And if they can't do it themselves, they'll find other ways. This is why we see people doing all sorts of things that we never thought they would do, because they're addicted. They'll, steal, lie, manipulate, like all these things. And again, it's the disease. It's not the person. That's the disease. Um, and so, yeah, don't give them the substance no matter what they say. The reality is certain substances can be dangerous to detox from on your own, because there's a risk of seizures and some other things. Um, and that's why detox places exist, right? You go to detox, it's, 5 days a week, depending on, the substance and the individual. And they will safely detox you with nurses and doctors and meds so that they know, they monitor you and make sure you're not seizing or whatever it is. Um, that is always an option. So if the person is saying to you, I need a fix, otherwise I'm going to be in so much pain, I'm going to be so sick, I'm not going to survive it, don't give them access to the substance. Just say, hey, let's get you to detox. So, like that's kind of where I see the line personally, is enabling, are you enabling them to use, or are you enabling them to get help? Like if you're saying, if they're willing to go get help and they need a ride to the facility, give them a ride, of course, right? Like that's not enabling in a bad way. That's helping in a really healthy, good way because they're saying, I want help. I want to get better. Um, but again, don't do anything that would help them keep using. So that's kind of where I see the line universally in general. What that looks like in specific situations, I think that is where we see some variables. Because, you know, I think it depends. Like if my situation with my mother was different than, let's say, parents who have a teenager who's using, because they're still a minor, like they're still a kid. It's a different situation. So, I think when it comes to that kind of situation, should parents help a little bit more than I did in my situation? Yeah, absolutely. Because he's a kid. They don't, they can't support themselves yet. Um, but yeah, I think it's just figuring out, really thinking about that. That's what I always remind myself of, really thinking about, am I helping steer them towards getting healthy, or am I helping them continue with what they've been doing?
And I think one of the things that goes along with that is that just in my sphere of people I know, things like that, is if someone who has a substance abuse issue doesn't ever face consequences for it, if people are always kind of saving them and making sure they don't face the repercussions of their behavior, then that's enabling, right? And that's really difficult for family members who love them. And someone might be spending their money on a substance and not paying their rent and then get evicted, and then that person has to live somewhere, and you're like, well, I don't want them to be homeless. What do I do? Like, that is a really hard line to walk of, well, if I pay your rent for you, then you're never going to learn the lesson. You're never going to get help. Like, what does someone do in that kind of a situation?
Yeah, I think something like that is one of those things that it's really personal choice and where your own
Yeah.
boundaries are. If you are going to do that, I would say you figure out a way to pay the landlord directly for the rent and don't give the money to the loved one because you don't know what they're actually going to do with that money.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but again, what you should do, it could go either way. And I don't think there's any wrong answer. I think it's just what your your own boundaries and what you want to do with it. And again, something that could change. You could do it once and then later on feel, oh, that didn't feel great. Next time
Mm-hmm.
I get asked this, I'm not going to do it anymore. And that's okay.
Yeah, and we always say on this podcast that you can change your mind.
Mhm.
You can change your mind. The situation can change. Your needs could change. Their needs could whatever. Um, so I guess that brings me to what's more important, setting the boundary or keeping the boundary, and when do shift?
Ooh, that's so hard. Um, they're
And
both
it's often
equally important.
they're both, yeah, and it's often situational, right?
Yes. Um, I mean, yes, both. I think I think for most people it's probably harder to keep the boundary, um, because that's something that takes ongoing work and practice and being able to sit with the discomfort of keeping a boundary. But again, everyone's different. So for some people, it might be setting it. But I think both are really important, because you have to figure out you have to figure out how to keep your own head above water. I think when I started going to Al-Anon years ago, I think one thing I heard that I like an analogy I heard that I loved was like, if someone's drowning, you don't jump in and try to save them because without training, they will pull you under with them in their panic, in their survival mode. You wait for a trained lifeguard to come in and help. And it's similar to having a loved one with a substance use disorder, right? Like you don't just dive right in and go try to save them because you will get pulled down under. You need to really think about a strategic way to help them while also keeping your own head above water. And that's something I think about quite a bit of
Hmm.
how much am I trying to save this person while ignoring my own needs, right? And how important is this thing to me, right? Like if we're talking about, okay, let's, pick a movie to watch tonight. Maybe I'm in the mood that night. I really want to watch a movie. It's important to me. I've been dying to see this movie and like I'm gonna fight hard for it. I'm gonna really stick by that. Or maybe I don't care that much. I'm open to whatever. It's not a battle I want to pick. And so I'll be more willing to compromise. Um, but I think the key is really reflecting and thinking about how important is this to me? Is this a battle I want to fight? Um, and if it is, how can I communicate that? And also really being aware of, you know, how much am I compromising my own wants and needs? I mean, the reality is, in any relationship, we have to compromise, we have to give and not get our way sometimes. That's just life. But it's about having this balance between the two. And I always tell people if you're feeling like you're not getting your needs met overall, that's probably something we should look at.
Hmm. So as you're talking, I'm thinking for myself, the question, is it easier or more important to set the boundary or keep the boundary? I find it's very easy for me to set the boundary. I can talk the talk, but keeping that boundary is where you walk the walk. And, I try to just even simple things like in my business, just trying to like, I'm going to block this day or block this time for myself, or I'm not going to accept this kind of a job or whatever. And then invariably this opportunity comes up, or can you meet on this day, or can I talk to you, and whatever. And I find myself still struggling, and I have to stop and say, it's analogous to, are my needs being met, or like, why did I set that boundary in the first place? What does that boundary serve to do? And if this other thing is encroaching past that boundary, is it taking away from that goal, or is it kind of in line with that goal? And that's kind of how I figure out, is it okay to bend the rule in this moment when people are in these really awkward, difficult, painful sometimes situations with people? What are the kinds of words, techniques, um, phrases, like how do you advise people? Well, first I want to say, let me back up a minute. um, you talked about how these neural pathways are built in our brains when we're young, and I want to just say there's hope. You can rebuild new neural pathways by doing this practice, by setting these boundaries, and by getting the feedback that the world isn't ending because I set a boundary. Like, you can, there's hope for people, right, to change these relationships, change these patterns we fall into. So I guess I would love to close with some advice for people of like, how, like, what are the words, what are the strategies you give people to do these things?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it absolutely is very, very doable. It just takes some work and some time. So, I always use the analogy of, breaking your arm. Your bone can heal. You got to put it in a cast for a while first, though, and that part's gonna suck. And you're gonna have to try and get used to some new ways of doing things. And once that cast comes off, you're going to be like, oh, great, this is awesome. I could do all the things again, right? And in this new way. Um, and it's the same with trauma and, changing our habits. So, um, I always just like to remind people progress with mental health is often very, very bumpy. It's often two steps forward, one step back. It is not linear at all. So, while when you have those setbacks, while it absolutely feels very real and you can feel like, oh, I'm back at square one, this is terrible, you're not back at square one. I promise you, you're not, even though it feels that way. And you want to keep going. You want to keep trying and working on it, because the more we work on it, the easier it gets. Just like learning any kind of new skill, the more you do it, the easier it gets. Um, and I like to also tell people that, you got to be comfortable with the discomfort a little bit, and just recognize that it is going to be uncomfortable. This is something new. It's going to feel scary. As humans, we are drawn to things and people and habits that are familiar, not necessarily things that we want or things that are healthy. Um, so that's why we repeat patterns, because they're familiar and we just know them really well. Um, so when you're doing this work, it's going to feel really uncomfortable. It's going to feel scary, probably. You might feel anxiety. You can have some physical sensations that are, as you do this work. Um, and that's all expected. So, that's okay. Um, I also say have some support, whether that's in therapy, with a coach, friends, family, whatever it is. Just have people you can talk to and go to walk you through the process, because again, it's not easy. Um, but yeah, when we think about, the research has shown, like in terms of therapy, it's the research shows the most important factor in growth in therapy is the relationship between therapist and client, not so much the type of therapy or what you talk about or how long you're in it or whatever. Um, the way we repair trauma is through relationships, through connection. We are pack animals. We are built to live in groups with other humans. And that connection to other humans is the most important factor in healing. So that's why I always tell people, focus on connecting with other people, being around other people. Even if you don't have a ton of people in your support system, work on building that support system. There's a lot of value there, because that's how you're going to get the most growth. Um, so yeah, I mean, those are kind of the things I like to tell people as they're starting this journey. And then in terms of the strategies of how to get there, there's lots of different ways. But I always say, I think the most important things are really having an understanding of the stress response, what happens in your own body when you experience stress, because everyone's different, being able to recognize how your body is feeling, um, and developing healthy coping skills to manage those stressful situations and those emotions. And not that it has to be perfect. We all once in a while are like, oh, I had a rough day. I want to eat an entire pizza and French fries and all the bad food. Like we all do that once in a while. It's fine. But how can we develop healthier coping skills that we rely on more often than the unhealthy ones?
Well, that is all great advice, and I really appreciate that and the rest of this conversation, Lianna. So many good things, so many insights I've learned just during this little time we've had together. So, tell our listeners how they can find you, follow you,
Yeah.
contact you, all the things.
Awesome. Yeah. So my coaching business is called Coaching with Lianna. That's Lianna. So my website is coachingwithlianna.com. And you can also follow me on Instagram at Coaching with Lianna.
Perfect. We'll make sure to put those links in our website's show note. I really appreciate everything you shared with us today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
That's a Hard No is a production of Clever Girl Marketing, my little agency in Cleveland, in partnership with our friends at Evergreen Podcasts. Many thanks to our amazing team, including Maura Del Rosario, our production and marketing coordinator, Noah Fouts, our amazing producer, editor, and composer who wrote our theme music and performed it with his band, The Big Leagues, and our new video producer and editor, Kay Holmberg. You can find show notes and resources on our website, and you can find other fun stuff on our socials. We're Hard No Podcast. Find your no, Then say it with me.